Chapter 4 of Louise de la Valliere. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Snoza, Houston, Texas, March 2013. Louise de la Valliere by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 4 The Rat and the Cheese. D'Artagnan and Porthos returned on foot, as D'Artagnan had set out. When D'Artagnan, as he entered the shop of the Pilon d'Or, announced to Planchet that Monsieur du Vallon would be one of the privileged travelers, and as the plume in Porthos's hat made the wooden candles suspended over the front jingle together, a melancholy presentiment seemed to eclipse the delight Planchet had promised himself for the morrow. But the grocer had a heart of gold, ever mindful of the good old times, a trait that carries youth into old age. So Planchet, notwithstanding a sort of internal shiver, checked as soon as experienced, received Porthos with respect mingled with the tenderest cordiality. Porthos, who was a little cold and stiff in his manners at first on account of the social difference existing at that period between a baron and a grocer, soon began to soften when he perceived so much good feeling and so many kind attentions in Planchet. He was particularly touched by the liberty which was permitted him to plunge his great palms into boxes of dried fruits and preserves, into sacks of nuts and almonds, and into the drawers full of sweetmeats, so that, notwithstanding Planchet's pressing invitations to go upstairs to the entresol, he chose as his favorite seat during the evening which he had to spend at Planchet's house, the shop itself, where his fingers could always fish up whatever his nose detected. The delicious figs from Provence, filberts from the forest, Tours plums were subjects of his uninterrupted attention for 5 consecutive hours. His teeth, like millstones, cracked heaps of nuts, the shells of which were scattered all over the floor, where they were trampled by every one who went in and out of the shop. Porthos pulled from the stalk with his lips at one mouthful bunches of the rich muscatel raisins in their beautiful bloom, 1/2 pound of which passed in one gulp from his mouth to his stomach. In one of the corners of the shop, Planchet's assistants huddled together, looking at each other without venturing to open their lips. They did not know who Porthos was, for they had never seen him before. The race of those Titans who had worn the cuirass of Hugh Capet, Philip Augustus, and Francis I had already begun to disappear. They could hardly help thinking he might be the ogre of a fairy tale who was going to turn the whole contents of Planchet's shop into his insatiable stomach, and that, too, without in the slightest degree displacing the barrels and chests that were in it. Cracking, munching, chewing, nibbling, sucking, and swallowing, Porthos occasionally said to the grocer, "You do a very good business here, friend Planchet." "He will very soon have none at all to do if this sort of thing continues," grumbled the foreman, who had Planchet's word that he should be his successor. In the midst of his despair, he approached Porthos, who blocked up the whole of the passage leading from the back shop to the shop itself. He hoped that Porthos would rise, and that this movement would distract his devouring ideas. "What do you want, my man?" asked Porthos affably. "I should like to pass you, monsieur, if it is not troubling you too much." "Very well," said Porthos. "It does not trouble me in the least." At the same moment he took hold of the young fellow by the waistband, lifted him off the ground, and placed him very gently on the other side, smiling all the while with the same affable expression. As soon as Porthos had placed him on the ground, the lad's legs so shook under him that he fell back upon some sacks of corks. But noticing the giant's gentleness of manner, he ventured again, and said, "Ah, monsieur, pray be careful." "What about?" inquired Porthos. "You are positively putting a fiery furnace into your body." "How is that, my good fellow?" "All those things are very heating to the system." "Which?" "Raisins, nuts, and almonds." "Yes, but if raisins, nuts, and almonds are heating, there's no doubt at all of it, monsieur." "Honey is very cooling," said Porthos, stretched out his hand towards a small barrel of honey which was open, and he plunged the scoop with which the wants of the customers were supplied into it, and swallowed a good 1/2 pound at one gulp. "I must trouble you for some water now, my man," said Porthos. "In a pail, monsieur?" asked the lad simply. "No, in a water bottle. That will be quite enough." And raising the bottle to his mouth as a trumpeter does his trumpet, he emptied the bottle in a single draught. Planchet was agitated in every fibre of propriety and self-esteem. However, a worthy representative of the hospitality which had prevailed in early days, he feigned to be talking very earnestly with D'Artagnan, and incessantly repeated, "Ah, monsieur, what a happiness! What an honor!" "What time shall we have supper, Planchet?" inquired Porthos. "I feel hungry." The foreman clasped his hands together. The two others got under the counters, fearing Porthos might have a taste for human flesh. "We shall only take a sort of a snack here," said D'Artagnan, "and when we get to Planchet's country seat, we'll have supper." We are going to your country house, Planchet," said Porthos. "So much the better. You overwhelm me, Monsieur le Baron." The Monsieur le Baron had a great effect upon the men, who detected a personage of the highest quality in an appetite of that kind. This title, too, reassured them. They had never heard that an ogre was ever called Monsieur le Baron. "I will take a few biscuits to eat on the road," said Porthos carelessly, and he emptied a whole jar of aniseed biscuits into a huge pocket of his doublet. "My shop is saved!" exclaimed Planchet. "Yes, as the cheese was," whispered the foreman. "What cheese?" "The Dutch cheese, inside which a rat had made his way, and we found only the rind left." Planchet looked around his shop, and observing the different articles which had escaped Porthos's teeth, he found the comparison somewhat exaggerated. The foreman, who remarked what was passing in his master's mind, said, "Take care, he has not gone yet." "Have you any fruit here?" said Porthos, as he went upstairs to the entresol, where it had just been announced that some refreshment was prepared. "Alas," thought the grocer, addressing a look at D'Artagnan full of entreaty, which the latter half understood. As soon as they had finished eating, they set off. It was late when the three riders, who had left Paris about 6 in the evening, arrived at Fontainebleau. The journey passed very agreeably. Porthos took a fancy to Planchet's society, because the latter was very respectful in his manners, and seemed delighted to talk to him about his meadows, his woods, and his rabbit warrens. Porthos had all the taste and pride of a landed proprietor. When D'Artagnan saw his two companions in earnest conversation, he took the opposite side of the road, and, letting his bridle drop on his horse's neck, separated himself from the whole world, as he had done from Porthos and from Planchet. The moon shone softly through the foliage of the forest. The breezes of the open country rose deliciously perfumed to the horses' nostrils, and they snorted and pranced along delightedly. Porthos and Planchet began to talk about hay crops. Planchet admitted to Porthos that in the advanced years of his life he had certainly neglected agricultural pursuits for commerce, but that his childhood had been passed in Picardy, in the beautiful meadows where the grass grew as high as the knees, and where he had played under the green apple trees covered with red-cheeked fruit. He went on to say that he had solemnly promised himself that as soon as he should have made his fortune, he would return to nature and end his days as he had begun them, as near as he possibly could to the earth itself, where all men must sleep at last. Said Porthos, "in that case, my dear Monsieur Planchet, your retirement is not far distant." "How so?" "Why, you seem to be in the way of making your fortune very soon." "Well, we're getting on pretty well, I must admit," replied Planchet. "Come, tell me what is the extent of your ambition, and what is the amount you intend to retire upon?" "There's one circumstance, monsieur," said Planchet, without answering the question, "which occasions me a good deal of anxiety." "What is it?" inquired Porthos, looking all round him, as if in search of the circumstance that annoyed Planchet, and desirous of freeing him from it. "Why, formerly," said the grocer, "you used to call me Planchet quite short, and you would have spoken to me then in a much more familiar manner than you do now." Certainly, I should have said so formerly," replied the good-natured Porthos, with an embarrassment full of delicacy. "But formerly I was Monsieur d'Artagnan's lackey." "Is not that what you mean?" "Well, if I am not quite his lackey, I am as much as ever I was his devoted servant, and more than that, since that time I have had the honor of being in partnership with him." Oh, said Porthos. "What, has D'Artagnan gone into the grocery business?" No, said D'Artagnan, whom these words had drawn out of his reverie, and who entered into the conversation with that readiness and rapidity which distinguished every operation of his mind and body. It was not D'Artagnan who entered into the grocery business, but Planchet who entered into a political affair with me. "Yes," said Planchet, with mingled pride and satisfaction. "We transacted a little business which brought me in 100,000 francs, and Monsieur d'Artagnan 200,000. Oh, said Porthos, with admiration. "So that, Monsieur le Baron," continued the grocer, I again beg you to be kind enough to call me Planchet, as you used to do, and to speak to me as familiarly as in old times. You cannot possibly imagine the pleasure it would give me." "If that be the case, my dear Planchet, I will do so, certainly," replied Porthos, and as he was quite close to Planchet, he raised his hand as if to strike him on the shoulder in token of friendly cordiality, but a fortunate movement of the horse made him miss his aim, so that his hand fell on the crupper of Planchet's horse instead, which made the animal's legs almost give way. D'Artagnan burst out laughing as he said, "Take care, Planchet, for if Porthos begins to like you too much, he will caress you, and if he caresses you, he will knock you flat as a pancake. Porthos is still as strong as ever, you know." "Oh," said Planchet, "Mousqueton is not dead, and yet Monsieur le Baron is very fond of him." "Certainly," said Porthos, with a sigh, which made all three horses rear, "and I was only saying this very morning to D'Artagnan how much I regretted him. But tell me, Planchet." "Thank you, Monsieur le Baron, thank you." Good lad, good lad. How many acres of park have you got?" "Of park?" "Yes, we will reckon up on the meadows presently, and the woods afterwards." "Whereabouts, monsieur? At your chateau?" "Oh, Monsieur le Baron, I have neither chateau, nor park, nor meadows, nor woods." "What have you got, then?" inquired Porthos. "And why do you call it a country seat?" "I did not call it a country seat, Monsieur le Baron," replied Planchet, somewhat humiliated, "but a country box." Ah, I understand. You are modest." "No, Monsieur le Baron, I speak the plain truth. I have room for a couple of friends, that's all." "But in that case, whereabouts do your friends walk?" "In the first place, they can walk about the king's forest, which is very beautiful." "Yes, I know the forest will be fine," said Porthos, "nearly as beautiful as my forest at Valliere." Planchet opened his eyes very wide. "You have a forest of the same kind as the forest at Fontainebleau, Monsieur le Baron?" he stammered out. "Yes, I have two, indeed, but the one at Valliere is my favorite." "Why so?" asked Planchet. "Because I don't know where it ends, and also because it is full of poachers." "How can the poachers make the forest so agreeable to you?" "Because they hunt my game, and I hunt them, which in these peaceful times is for me a sufficiently pleasing picture of war on a small scale." They had reached this turn of conversation when Planchet, looking up, perceived the houses at the commencement of Fontainebleau, the lofty outlines of which stood out strongly against the misty visage of the heavens, whilst, rising above the compact and irregularly formed mass of buildings, the pointed roofs of the chateau were clearly visible, the slates of which glistened beneath the light of the moon like the scales of an immense fish. "Gentlemen," said Planchet, "I have the honor to inform you that we have arrived at Fontainebleau." End of chapter 4.